again, Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to my memorial for my mother, Mom's favorites books my mother loved. Books that my father did not necessarily love. Well, okay, that second part is just a subtitle based on the fact that my father insisted on telling me several times about various books on this list that really he didn't think much of. But not really the point. So the last time we did this, we were talking about 42nd Parallel, which is the first book, the first section, the first whatever you want to think of it, of the USA trilogy. 1919, which is the second part of the USA trilogy, is, yes, it's a sequel, and temporally, in a lot of ways, it does pick up right after the first book. I am going to now show you a second cover because this had to come out of the library and I read these books so slowly that, well, I wound up with this one as well. And here we go. There's the cover because this was also, like the last one, illustrated by Mr. Reginald Marsh, whoever he may be. I haven't bothered to look him up. So the first thing you notice when you crack this book open, and I'm just going to move into some pictures. The first thing that you notice with this book is that most of the characters in this, a lot of the characters in this book are characters that were background characters, side characters, the other person in this friendship characters from the first book. So we had Eleanor's perspective in the first book, so in this second book we get her best friend Eveline's perspective. We had the secretary who throughout this book goes by Miss Williams. Her brother Joe Williams opens this book. And as we go through this and you see these various people going past and you recognize the people on the other side of this as people from the first book. The thing about the first book was that it all sort of, at various points, all of these characters dovetailed together in the first book. Well, in the second book, you have more of the same. You have more of these people all running into each other, all winding up in the same places. Which, among other things, let's pick another picture. Among other things in this book, it gives it a very small world, ain't it, atmosphere. Which, you know, on the one hand, yes, small world, ain't it, but on the other hand, the US is a very, very large country. The fact is, most countries the world over have sufficiently large populations that it's not really all that likely that if you pick any random group of people from random places that they will in fact all come in contact with each other. Because as much as you may want to play 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, the fact is the reason why 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon works is because Hollywood isn't actually all that big. Yes, I know 6 Degrees of Separation and 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon was just a game. The point is that a lot of these people running into each other is kind of not really a thing you should expect. This particular book, though, unlike the first one was very, very focused on labor issues. Like, that was kind of the thing. It was, most of the first book took place in the US, and most of it involved having various people involved in one way or another with one side or another to the labor movement. But this book picks up with something that was just a backdrop in the first one, and that is the First World War. You know, Joe Williams becomes part of the Merchant Marines during the First World War. You have Eleanor and Eveline, who both joined the Red Cross and went overseas. You have all of these people who, for various reasons, volunteered and joined up and so on and so forth, or, were forced into it because the government was, doing conscription at the time. That was one of those things that happened during the World Wars, was all of that conscription, forcing people who otherwise really wouldn't have joined the army into joining, and conscientious objectors and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of people there in this book who are in Paris, in France, in Italy. There's a lot of time spent in Italy and in France. And there's a lot of the hail fellow well met that goes on at the time, because of course, when the Americans did rush to enter the war, it was this infusion of, fresh people who were optimistic and who weren't worn down by the war, and it's kind of coming in at the last minute with a last minute save, and so people kind of liked the Americans who came in. Also, of course, people at the time liked President Wilson because he made the decision, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of that, and in this particular book, we get kind of a flip side, because we get this flip side to it of all of these people. Now, we're not getting front lines on the war stuff. This isn't one of those horror war stories where we hear about mustard gas and the screams of the dying and everybody being desperate for, fresh air and life and so on and so forth. This is people who were behind the lines and who never really saw the front lines, and who managed in various ways and means to avoid being on the front lines. And so to them, the war is not very much of a war. I mean, maybe I'm missing some subtext. I'm usually missing subtext when I read these, but there's a lot of this where people are instead talking about the Bolsheviks, they're talking about the Russian Revolution, they're talking about, well, the labor movement, because the labor movement was one of those important things at the time. But whereas in the first book, the war was kind of going on in the background and building up to a kind of climax in the first book, in this one, the labor movement is going on in the background and building up to a climax. And you have all of these various stories going on in and around it, and just like the first book, you have people getting beat up, you have a war going on, you have excitement and girls making bad decisions, and I saved the copyright information for my own purposes and I should have put it somewhere else. Anyways, last picture. Let's go back to somebody getting beat up. I think that might have been Joe. The thing is that when you've got this book that, like the last one, makes everybody sound the same. I'm getting used to it. So the voices are starting to differentiate themselves, but they're differentiating themselves more because I've gotten used to how the books read than because there is any real true differentiation. And let me put it this way, it's a little bit like when you try to massage a particular theory in someone else's universe to make it fit everything else. Things like the Marvel No Prize, where people would look at inconsistencies between one comic book and another comic book that said something different and would write into Marvel saying, well, if you say this, it resolves the inconsistency. And the thing is that maybe you can resolve the inconsistency, but the fact that you have to put in a conscious effort to figure out how to do it and to make it work means that it's not really that consistent. In this case, the voices are too much the same. Yes, okay, if I dedicate the time and effort, I can eventually start to pick out the differences. But that almost seems counterintuitive to me in this book, because this book seems to be very much leaning on the idea of everybody being the same deep down. But if everybody's going to be the same deep down, it strikes me that you should really try to write it in a way that makes them all sound different, and the longer you read, the more alike they sound, rather than the longer you read, the easier it is to tell them all apart and to pick them apart and to see who these people are. I read the foreword to one of these two copies, and I'm not really going to talk about it much, mainly because the next of books off of my father's list also had a lengthy foreword, and I really shouldn't be reading a John Dos Passos and a John Steinbeck massive foreword for two books, both of which written during the height of the labor movement, about the labor movement. I really shouldn't read two forewords at the same time, because they're going to get all confuzzled in my head. But the one thing that stood out from the foreword for me about this book was someone pointing out that everyone in this book eventually sort of gives up and becomes not amoral per se, but gives up on their various ethics and ideals and so on and so forth. And I can see to an extent that that's there, of course. But the problem is that you're dealing with a book that appears to be collectively about a bunch of people who didn't know all that much to begin with and weren't all that interested in it really. That, you know, they were the kind of people that who were kind of armchair quarterbacks about important things. You know, that they're not politicians, they are people who do negotiations in and around politicians, but they're not actually doing the hard work of politics. They're people who are trying to be part of the labor movement, but they're not really getting deep and down into it because they keep getting distracted by other things. You know, they're women who think that they're going to be artists, but they never really knuckle down to doing the art part of it because they're so distracted by exciting other things. And so, you know, you can talk about this similarity, but it's a problem with this book that it's a book about a lot of very small people. And yes, the world is made up of small people. And I suppose there's something edifying about a book about a bunch of small people, but small people make for tiresome reading because, since most of us you're basically reading about yourself, and it's not a very flattering yourself, and, well, it's not something that appeals very much, but then again, like I always say, I'm extremely shallow. Anyway, so I can't really say all that much good about this book. This is another one of those books where I suppose if I really put in the effort, I could figure out what to say in terms of artistic depth and so on, but I'm not really picking it up because this isn't a book about how great the USA is. It's a book about how small everyone in it is. And not small in a good way. We're not talking small in a, you know, they'll knuckle down and they'll get the job done because if you get enough people behind it, they'll manage something sort of small way. These are people who are very emotionally small, and frankly, it's draining reading about them, and yeah. So that's about everything I have to say about this, and we'll see next week whether I manage to pull off reading the Steinbeck. And that's everything, so I will see you all next week.